the value or not of taking dietary supplements of minerals and vitamins. In Australia, on average, about 1 in 2 women and over 1 in 3 men are taking dietary supplements. The rate is even higher amongst part of the population who can better afford them. Despite the ubiquity of supplements, whether they benefit people is still controversial. Randomised trials have come up with mixed results, which are hard to generalise, given the range of macronutrients, the various doses, and the long durations people take them. And that's without taking account of what we eat in our food. Which is why a group from Tufts University in Boston analysed findings from 30,000 people from the general US population over 20 years, looking at death rates from all causes and cancer and heart disease in particular. Fanfan Zhang is a nutrition and cancer epidemiologist at Tufts.
We found several interesting findings. First is that we found dietary supplement use were not associated with mortality benefits.
So in other words, it didn't reduce premature death. It didn't make you live longer.
No.
And that's across the board when you dissected it by antioxidants, by vitamin D, vitamin A, vitamin C. When you looked across the board, it wasn't reducing the premature death rate.
Right.
But when they initially looked at the findings, the benefits of supplements looked much clearer. Fanfan Zhang again.
We look at 25 different nutrients. Initially, all of these were all associated with a reduced risk of all-cause mortality. However, when we further control for the potential impact of education and other lifestyle factors, all the associations disappeared.
So what you're saying here is that if you look at it crudely, it did look as though those supplements benefited your death risk, but in fact it was more about the sort of people who take those supplements rather than the supplements themselves.
That's exactly what our results suggest. Dietary supplement use is highly correlated with education, income, and healthy lifestyle.
When it came to the effects of the dose of the vitamins and minerals, it was more complicated because they had to take into account the intake from food as well. And there too, there were some fascinating results.
We did first find associations between adequate intake of several nutrients for our lower risk of death, including vitamin A, vitamin K, magnesium, and zinc. But when we look at dose, these are not the total. We first look at the total nutrient intake combined from supplements and from food sources. When we look at the same nutrients separately from food sources versus from supplement sources, all the associations that we found was attributable to the nutrient intake from foods, not from supplements.
You found some troubling results for both calcium and vitamin D.
That's right. We took the same approach. We first looked at the total nutrient intake above a certain level called upper tolerable level. When the total calcium intake is above this level, that we saw an increased risk of cancer. So a higher calcium intake was associated with a higher risk of death from cancer.
And was that from supplements or from food or from total intake?
Then we break down the associations looking at from foods and from supplements, and we did not observe association for calcium from foods.
So it looked as though it was supplements.
Yeah, it's from supplements. Also, when we talk about dose, right, it was for a dose more than 1,000 milligrams a day. So in other words, if it's from foods, we didn't find association with increased risk of cancer death. When it's from supplements, when the dose was lower than 1,000 milligrams a day, there were also no significant associations. But when the dose was above 1,000 milligrams a day from supplement sources, there were suggestions of increased risk of death from cancer.
Tell me about your findings with vitamin D.
We were able to break down participants into two categories. One, individuals with what we call vitamin D insufficiency. Their vitamin D level is low versus the people with no signs of vitamin D insufficiency. Among the participants with no signs of vitamin D insufficiency, meaning they're adequate for vitamin D, use of vitamin D supplement at a dose of 400 international units a day was associated with increased risk of all-cause death and cancer death.
Which is a bit troubling given that there's been a suggestion, at least in Australia, that it's safe to take vitamin D supplements
I would be cautious about it because we're perhaps one of the few studies that reported harms. So I think it needs to be further evaluated.
What did it look like when you looked at populations which had lower nutrient intake? In other words, there are groups of people who might not get enough nutrient intake,
right.
and therefore it superficially might look as though it's a good thing to give multivitamin supplements. Were you able to evaluate that?
That's a very good question. So our study, because it is our U.S. general population, we do not have specific indicator in this study to further break down by certain subgroups, with nutrition deficiency. So our study findings, I would say, cannot be applied to the certain subgroups with nutrition deficiency. The only nutrient we were able to evaluate here is vitamin D because the marker through serum is available from the survey.
So I take it you're throwing all your multivitamins in the waste paper bin?
I would say that the general population should not be advised to take dietary supplements. But whether the specific subgroups may benefit needs to be further studied. This would include pregnant women, lactating women, which are excluded from the study. It could also include persons with chronic health conditions that may impact the ability to absorb nutrients from foods adequately. It could also include people with certain dietary practice, such as vegetarian vegans.
Fan Zhong is a nutrition and cancer epidemiologist at Tufts University in Boston. You're listening to the Health Report here on RN. I'm Norman Swan.